March 1941. The Mediterranean Sea, near Cape Matapan. The Italian fleet, confident in their speed and the cover of darkness, steamed toward their base. Admiral Angelo Iachino expected no attack. In 1941, it was a naval axiom that battleships did not fight at night. It was too chaotic, too risky. But in the blackness, invisible eyes were watching. British battleships, equipped with early Type 279 radar, closed to point-blank range while remaining undetected. Suddenly, the night was split by artificial suns as British searchlights snapped on, blinding the Italians. Within minutes, 3 Italian heavy cruisers were reduced to burning wrecks. The Battle of Cape Matapan was the first definitive proof that the night was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a hunting ground for those who could see through technology. For centuries, darkness had acted as a natural ceasefire. Soldiers would hunker down, wait for dawn, and try to survive the cold. But in World War II, the forgotten battles of the night changed the nature of conflict forever. The clash at Matapan was just the beginning of a technological and psychological revolution. It wasn't just about who had the bigger guns, it was about who could conquer the human fear of the unseen. While the Italians relied on traditional lookouts, the British were using electromagnetic waves to pierce the void. This was the birth of electronic warfare, a shadow game where the prize was the ability to strike first from the blackness. This series explores the war that history books often ignore because it couldn't be captured on the film of the era. We will analyze how German night fighters turned the skies over the Reich into a graveyard for British bombers using the secret Liechtenstein radar. We will enter the jungles of Guadalcanal, where Japanese soldiers, trained to see in the dark without instruments, launched terrifying night assaults that pushed U.S. Marines to the brink of madness. We will see the first steps of infrared technology, from the German Vampir scopes on assault rifles to the massive searchlights used to simulate artificial moonlight during the crossing of the Oder. The night rewarded the patient and the technologically cold-blooded. It turned the battlefield into a psychological labyrinth where a single snapping twig could trigger mass panic. As the war progressed, the veil of darkness was systematically stripped away, replaced by green-tinted screens and radar scopes. This is the story of how humanity learned to kill in the dark, and how these forgotten night battles paved the way for modern, 24/7 warfare. As the fires of the Blitz faded, the air war over Europe became mechanical and invisible. The Battle of the Beams had shown that the sky was no longer just physical, it was electronic. For RAF Bomber Command, night offered concealment, but not safety. Waiting in the darkness were the knack-jagged night fighters, twin-engine hunters like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and the Junkers Ju-88, guided by radar rather than sight. At the center of German defense stood the Kammhuber Line. A grid of radar-controlled boxes stretching across Western Europe. Each sector used early warning and tracking radar to guide a single fighter toward incoming bombers in a tightly managed interception system known as Himmelbett. In the early years, it worked efficiently. British bombers, scattered across wide areas, were intercepted one by one. Crews often never saw their attacker. The system evolved further with airborne radar. Liechtenstein sets allowed night fighters to detect bombers independently at close range. Pilot and radar operator worked as a coordinated pair, following faint blips across glowing screens until the target filled the gun sight. Combat was silent until the final burst of cannon fire. The British response was not to dismantle the grid, but to overload it. The bomber stream tactic concentrated hundreds of aircraft into a narrow corridor, overwhelming individual radar cells. Precision defense struggled against mass. The sky became crowded, chaotic, and dangerous, but sustainable for a side with greater production. In 1943, during the bombing of Hamburg, the RAF introduced window, millions of aluminum strips cut to disrupt German radar frequencies. Screens filled with false echoes. Controllers lost clarity. For the first time, the electronic advantage shifted decisively. Germany adapted with improvisation. Under Wild Sow tactics, day fighters hunted at night using searchlights and the glow of burning cities to spot silhouettes. Later, Zhang Sao allowed radar-guided fighters to roam beyond rigid sector boundaries. Control loosened in exchange for flexibility. One innovation, however, proved especially lethal: Schrägmusik. Upward-firing cannons mounted behind the cockpit allowed German fighters to approach bombers from below, their weakest defensive blind spot, and fire directly into fuel tanks and bomb bays. Many RAF crews never knew they were under attack until their aircraft exploded from within. The night fighter had become part of a system. Victory depended less on individual skill and more on integration, radar, communication, interception. The war in the dark was a contest of networks. Britain responded with hunters of its own. The de Havilland Mosquito, fast and versatile, became a night fighter that hunted German interceptors. Equipped with radar, Mosquito crews patrolled above bomber streams, turning the tables on the Nakjagd. Electronic warfare intensified. New radar frequencies met new jamming techniques. Warning receivers detected hostile emissions. Intelligence operations fed rapid countermeasures. When an intact Ju-88 night fighter landed in Scotland after its crew defected, British engineers analyzed its radar systems, accelerating adaptation. By 1944, Europe's night sky was saturated with pulses and interference. Aircraft carried not only bombs but transmitters, receivers, and operators trained to interpret shifting signals. The romantic image of aerial duels had given way to mathematics and electronics. Yet despite tactical successes, German night fighters could not halt the bomber offensive. Losses were heavy, but Allied production replaced them. The Kammhuber Line, precise but rigid, struggled against scale. Each innovation was eventually countered. Technology alone proved insufficient without industrial depth. For air crews, however, strategy was distant. Their world was engine vibration, frozen oxygen masks, whispered radar corrections, and sudden flashes beneath the fuselage. Night magnified isolation. Aircraft vanished into cloud banks without witnesses. Survivors described the darkness as something alive, dense with unseen threats. Morale depended on perceived technological advantage. News of window boosted confidence. Rumors of new German radar undermined it. Science became psychological armor. By late 1944, fuel shortages crippled German pilot training, radar stations were destroyed, and the Nakjagd network fractured. Innovation continued, but resources dwindled. The electronic battlefield had demonstrated a central truth of modern war: superiority required not just invention, but production, infrastructure, and endurance. Over Europe, the night had become an equation. Wavelengths, vectors, signals. But elsewhere, darkness would take another form. In the Pacific, night warfare would not be defined by radar screens and radio pulses, but by proximity, flares over jungle canopy, silhouettes in humid air, and enemies only meters apart. The hunters in the void would give way to hunters in the jungle. And once again, technology would prove only as strong as the system that sustained it. On the island of Guadalcanal, the concept of night warfare returned to its most primitive and terrifying roots. While the air war over Europe was becoming a battle of electronic pulses, the struggle for the Solomon Islands was a battle of the human nervous system. For the U.S. Marines, the jungle at night wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity that favored the Japanese. In the early stages of the Pacific War, the Japanese soldier was the undisputed master of the dark. They were rigorously trained in night infiltration, using specialized high-power binoculars and even diet-based eye conditioning to sharpen their natural night vision. They didn't rely on technology, they relied on silence and the psychological paralysis of their enemy. The nights on Guadalcanal were defined by harassing fire and the bonsai charge. Japanese units would slip through the dense undergrowth, communicating with bird calls and snapping twigs to bypass American perimeters. Their goal was to create organized chaos, to trigger a blind, panicked firefight where the Marines would waste ammunition and reveal their positions. The sheer psychological weight of the unseen enemy led to a condition known as jungle rot of the mind. Every rustle of a leaf was a potential bayonet, every shadow was a killer. This was the forgotten cost of night warfare, the exhaustion of men who were too afraid to close their eyes for weeks at a time. At sea, the nightmare continued in the Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese long-lance torpedo was a silent, wakeless killer that thrived in the dark. During the Battle of Savo Island, the U.S. Navy suffered one of its worst defeats because they relied too heavily on early, unreliable radar, while Japanese lookouts used their trained eyes to spot American ships miles away in the blackness. The Japanese would launch torpedo spreads and then vanish into the night before the first American gun could even be aimed. The U.S. Navy was forced to learn a bitter lesson: technology is a liability if it creates a false sense of security. To break the Japanese hold on the night, the Marines had to adapt or die. They began using trip flares and perimeter bells, turning the jungle's own sounds against the infiltrators. They learned to stay motionless in their foxholes, firing only when they could see the whites of an enemy's eyes to avoid giving away their location. This was a war of total sensory immersion, where the sense of smell and hearing became more important than sight. As the Pacific Campaign moved forward, the Americans slowly integrated their industrial might, introducing the first portable infrared sniper scopes, to finally strip the Japanese of their greatest weapon, the shadows. As the Americans mastered the jungle night, the focus of the war shifted back to the European mainland, where the miracle of technology was about to take its most futuristic and eerie form on the banks of the Oder. By 1945, the darkness that had once protected the retreating Wehrmacht was being systematically dismantled by Allied engineering. During the final push into Germany, specifically at the Battle of the Seelow Heights, the Soviet Red Army introduced a surreal phenomenon: artificial moonlight. Marshal Zhukov positioned 143 massive searchlights behind his infantry, aiming them directly at the German lines. The goal was to blind the defenders and illuminate the path for the Soviet tanks. However, the plan backfired. The light reflected off the thick dust and smoke of the opening artillery barrage, creating a blinding fog that disoriented the Soviets more than the Germans. This technological sun proved that manipulating the night was as dangerous as fighting in it. While the Soviets were trying to turn night into day, the Germans were perfecting the art of fighting in total blackness. This era saw the birth of infrared warfare. German engineers developed the ZG-1229 Vamper infrared sniper scope, a bulky system consisting of a massive lamp and a heavy battery pack worn as a backpack. For the first time in history, a soldier could see a heat signature in pitch-black conditions without revealing his own position to the naked eye. Sniper units equipped with the Vamper became ghosts of the Eastern Front, picking off Soviet patrols at ranges where they felt completely safe under the veil of night. This technology wasn't limited to infantry. The Germans also deployed the WWII searchlight vehicles, which provided infrared illumination for Panther tanks equipped with FG-1250 active infrared sights. This allowed tank crews to engage targets at night from over 600 meters away, a distance that seemed impossible to Allied crews, who still relied on muzzle flashes to aim. These Night Panthers were the ancestors of modern thermal warfare, turning the final battles of the Reich into a high-tech hunt. However, like many of the Wunderwaffe projects, these systems were produced in too few numbers to stem the tide. They were brilliant inventions serving a dying empire. The introduction of infrared and artificial light signaled the end of the natural night in warfare. The battlefield was becoming a place of 24-hour lethality where the human eye was no longer the primary sensor. But as the high-tech equipment of the European front pushed boundaries, another group of night warriors was perfecting a much simpler, more brutal form of shadow combat: the elite paratroopers and saboteurs who dropped into the dark of occupied Europe. As the technology of infrared and radar reached its peak, the most effective night weapon remained the human element: the elite paratroopers and saboteurs of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and the OSS. For these soldiers, the night was not just a tactical advantage, it was their only chance for survival. On the eve of D-Day, June 6, 1944, over 13,000 American and 7,000 British paratroopers dropped into the pitch-black sky over Normandy. This was the largest night airborne operation in history, and it quickly descended into what became known as the Night of the Crickets. The drop was a chaotic disaster. Cloud cover and heavy flak scattered the planes, dropping men miles from their zones into flooded marshes and thick hedgerows. In the total darkness, the paratroopers used a simple, low-tech tool to find each other, a small brass clicker called a cricket. One click demanded two in response. It was a primitive form of acoustic identification that allowed isolated soldiers to form, scratch, units in the dark. The confusion, however, was mutual. The German defenders, hearing rustles and clicks from every direction, believed they were surrounded by an army much larger than it actually was. The darkness acted as a force multiplier, turning a scattered group of lost men into a psychological nightmare for the garrison Germans. While the paratroopers created chaos in the fields, the SOE was conducting a different kind of night war. Operating in the shadows of occupied Europe, agents relied on the moonlight scale, planning operations around the lunar cycle to facilitate nighttime parachute drops and Lysander landings on improvised grass strips. These forgotten battles were fought at the crossroads of sabotage and intelligence, where blowing up a bridge or a power plant under the cover of night did more damage than a 1,000-bomber raid. They used silenced weapons like the Welrod pistol, designed specifically for the quiet, close-quarters work of the night. The success of these night operations proved that the veil of darkness was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. By the time the sun rose over Normandy, the German command was paralyzed, unable to coordinate a response because they couldn't see the true shape of the threat. The night had been mastered not just by those with the best radar, but by those with the steeliest nerves. Yet, even as the paratroopers secured the bridges, a final, chilling form of night combat was unfolding in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where the forgotten soldiers of the winter night faced the ultimate test of endurance. By December 1944, the night had become a literal killer. During the Battle of the Bulge, the struggle for the Ardennes forest wasn't just a battle between armies, it was a battle against the elements in a state of near-permanent darkness. In the deep winter of Western Europe, the nights lasted 16 hours, leaving soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes with a visibility of less than 10 feet. This was the forgotten nightmare of the winter night, where the primary enemy was hypothermia, and the primary weapon was the patrol. For the American GIs holding the line at Bastogne, the night was a period of sensory deprivation. To prevent frostbite, soldiers were forbidden from lighting fires, and the mechanical noise of tanks was muffled by the thick, falling snow. This created an eerie, silent battlefield where the only way to detect an enemy was through smell. The scent of German tobacco or the metallic tang of a heating stove. The Germans utilized this white darkness to launch infiltration teams dressed in captured American uniforms, led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny. These saboteurs changed road signs and cut telephone wires in the dead of night, creating a level of paranoia so intense that American troops began arresting their own officers for failing to name the winner of the World Series. Combat in the Ardennes night was short, brutal, and fought at point-blank range. Because tracers and muzzle flashes gave away positions instantly, many of these encounters were settled with knives, bayonets, and grenades. The darkness was so absolute that entire platoons could pass within yards of each other without knowing it. This led to the development of the foxhole buddy system, a psychological necessity where men stayed awake in shifts, holding onto each other's jackets to ensure no one was snatched away in the silence. The forgotten soldiers of the winter night suffered a unique form of trauma, a state of constant, high-alert waiting in sub-zero temperatures that broke the spirit of even the most hardened veterans. As the sun began to rise over the frozen Ardennes, the realization set in. The night had been the great equalizer. It had stripped away the Allied advantage in air power and armor, forcing the war back into a primitive struggle for survival. But the era of the natural night was reaching its end. The lessons learned in the frozen forests and the humid jungles were about to be synthesized into the final, high-tech evolution of night warfare, a transition that would lead from the chaos of 1945 directly into the green-tinted reality of the modern age. By May 1945, the darkness had been officially conquered. The forgotten battles fought in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the Ardennes had stripped the night of its mystery, replacing it with a new, electronic reality. The war had proven that the side that could dominate the shadows held the ultimate strategic advantage. This wasn't just a military shift, it was a fundamental change in human perception. The transition from the natural night of the early war to the synthetic night of 1945 laid the direct groundwork for every special forces operation and night vision system used in the 21st century. The technological leap was staggering. The German Vampir infrared scopes and the British Liechtenstein radar were no longer just experiments, they were the ancestors of modern thermal imaging and stealth technology. After the war, the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to seize these night secrets, sparking a new arms race to see who could own the darkness. The lessons of Guadalcanal taught modern militaries the importance of psychological conditioning for low-visibility combat, while the chaos of D-Day led to the development of the sophisticated IFF, identification friend or foe, systems we use today to prevent friendly fire in the dark. The ultimate legacy of World War II night warfare is the 24/7 battlefield. Before 1939, war had a rhythm, it stopped when the sun went down. Today, that rhythm is gone. Modern special forces, equipped with Gen 3 night vision and drone-linked thermal sensors, actually prefer to fight in the dark, turning what was once a source of terror into their greatest ally. The soldiers of World War II, who huddled in frozen foxholes at Bastogne or squinted through primitive scopes on the Oder, were the pioneers of this green-tinted world. They were the first to learn that in the modern age, there is no such thing as hiding in the shadows. The forgotten battles of the night remind us that technology only solves half the problem. The other half remains human, the ability to maintain discipline and courage when you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. World War II took the ancient fear of the dark and weaponized it, turning the veil of night into a complex, high-tech labyrinth. As we look at the silent, digital strikes of today, we see the echoes of those first radar pulses and infrared lamps, a reminder that the night was won not just by the brightest lights, but by the steeliest nerves. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel for more history without myths.